Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Sprint 202 review. This was a normal 2-week sprint. As usual, I'll start with the overview, Jeffrey on the UI, Adam on providers, Joe on the platform, and Keenan on the API. As you can see, this sprint was pretty typical with 71 PRs merged this sprint and 86 PRs opened. And there was a bit of a focus on bugs this sprint, but generally it was a pretty typical sprint. And over to Jeffrey on the UI.
Hi. In this sprint, 20 PRs got merged into the classic repo, in which 13 are bugs, 5 are enhancements, and 2 others. I can explain about them in the following slides. In host monitoring timeline form, David removed the reset button and renamed it to save button, renamed the save button to apply in order to match the original form. Next slide. When the services page was de-explorized, a page was removed, and the details, provisioning, retirement, job, these tabs were removed in that page. And also the VMs list was also not present after the conversion, and this list was also brought back in this PR. Next slide. When the tabs were converted to React component, there was a bug in the service catalog item form. This issue was the content of the tabs were not changing as expected. This was because the div structure and its tab contents were not properly aligned. This PR aligns these divs and makes sure all the tabs work. Next slide. When the custom buttons are clicked from the provider's summary page, a routing error was thrown into a dialog, and an external developer configured this method inside the routing file. Next slide. So as part of the HTML list to structured list conversion, a few of the recent PRs helper file had escape methods. This is already handled by React, so we don't need to require it anymore. Akhil went through all of these files and removed the H method from the helper files. Next slide. The AutoSD team added a customizable disk size field to the VM post provision. Related PRs were merged in core and VMware providers repo. Next slide. In configuration diagnostics, server by roles and roles by server selected items, the summary pages were converted from HTML list to structured list by Akhil. Next slide. We did not have a feature to delete a VM with infra providers before. The AutoSD team introduced a delete feature in the list and summary page. Changes are also introduced in the IBM Power HMC providers repo. Next slide. David introduced some CSS changes to the timeline form. Validations and choosing dates were removed as default 2 weeks dates were already present here. Next slide. Earlier, it was possible to create custom buttons or actions for physical servers, physical chassis, physical storage, switches, racks. An external developer introduced these buttons in their respective summary pages. Next slide. For others, Akhil fixed few lint errors in the recently merged PRs. David had also fixed an old JS code related to timeline by fixing a lot of lint errors and making it readable. That's all from UI side. Over to Adam.
Thanks, Jeffrey. For providers this sprint, we added support for deleting VMs via the Infra Manager, as Jeffrey mentioned. Previously, the only way to delete a VM was via retirement. And if some of the different state machines didn't actually delete the VM if we didn't provision it, so there was no way through our UI to forcibly delete the VM. And so the HMC team was able to add that support to the core Infra Manager. The AutoSD team added a nice enhancement to core to allow for customizable disk sizes as part of the post-provisioning process for a VM. This will be hooked up later in the VMware provider, so we can discuss it there. And Eliza from the Power team added resource pools to the Cloud Manager so that they can track those as part of the Power VS provider. For AutoSDE, they added another state in their EMS refresh state machine to wait for an internal AutoSDE refresh task to complete before starting our internal EMS refresh. Basically, what was happening was the storage would get provisioned, and we would immediately do a refresh, and it wasn't being represented in the API because it hadn't completed internally yet. And so they added a step to wait for AutoSDE to internally refresh their database so that the API would be reflective of the changes that were made. For Cisco Intersight, they added a collection of physical server profile templates. This is going to be used to allow provisioning of physical servers. Next slide. For HMC, as Jeffrey mentioned, they added support for destroying LPARs, which are VMs in the HMC parlance. For Kubernetes, we improved the verification of default credentials. Essentially, we would check to make sure the credentials were valid, but we weren't checking to make sure that the credentials had access to cluster level resources. So if you used something which could only read in your own project, we would verify the credentials successfully, and then we would immediately fail to refresh when we tried to request resources across all projects. And so that led to an issue where the refresh worker would fail, start up again, credentials would verify successfully, and then it would fail. And so what we're doing now is we're doing a quick list of all projects across the cluster to make sure that you have the cluster reader role associated with the service account that you've given us. We also fixed an issue where a blank metric authentication record was being created due to some weirdness in how the DDF parameters were being persisted. This led us to say that the metrics endpoint was valid, so we would go to collect metrics, but then when we actually tried to hit Prometheus, the authentication record was invalid, and so that led to a bunch of errors in the logs, and so we fixed that up. And we also fixed an issue where the metrics collector was running even with invalid credentials. This was due to a method rename, and so the provider classes were overriding a method that was no longer used. Next slide. For Over, we added support for creating networks, subnets, and routers as part of the network manager. The Over OVN network manager is actually subclassing the OpenStack network manager, and so all the code was already there, but we were missing the supports features, and in addition to that, we had to confirm that on a live test that the APIs were actually working, and all the parameters that we passed were correct. And so we did a quick test on that and confirmed that it works, so you can now manage your OVN network resources via the Overt and Rev providers. And for VMware, as we mentioned previously, the customizable disk is an option on VMware VM provisioning now. Essentially what this does is after we finish provisioning or cloning the template to the target VM, we will do a reconfigure at the end to resize the root disk size. It can only be increased, and it only will work on the first disk. So before we power the VM on, we'll do a reconfigure to extend the size of the disk so that it's available once the VM is powered on. That is it for providers. Over to Joe.
Okay, for core enhancements, Adam already mentioned the first two here, but it's worth mentioning anyway. Damien added the permissions and role changes to delete a VM through the infrastructure manager, and Eliza added resource pools as an association to the cloud manager. Next, Keenan improved the performance of MIQ create by caching the zone lookups. Adam continued on his path toward non-Rails workers by giving them worker settings. Keenan consolidated the supported storage types to simplify some conditional logic. Let's see, Brandon added the Ansible 5.4 RPM, and then with that, Jason removed the Ansible run repository, for Codified and appliance builds and locked us down to that 5.4 version. Brandon added debugging for Codified build failures by showing what was in the local RPM directory that was used for that build. And Gal added capability columns to storage models as JSONB fields. Next slide. For core bugs for Codified, Brandon changed all Postgres connections to use SSL if certificates are detected. Adam fixed an issue where providers supporting streaming refresh could be told to do full refreshes, resulting in poor performance and other bugs. Jason fixed Ruby 3 keyword argument issues in 2 places, when launching Ansible Runner and when we deserialize Ansible Runner responses. I fixed a test issue where we were indirectly upgraded to Net SMTP version 0.2.2, and that broke our test. That version changed the default interface for creating exceptions in Net SMTP, and so we had to hack around that. Brandon temporarily locked down License Finder to 7.0.1 since 7.1.0 broke us. And Brandon also forced the default global build settings as some were not enabled and caused Mock to build without support for SSL. And that's all for core.
Okay, and we'll do the API. On the API side, an enhancement was made to support custom actions, which are custom buttons on all the physical infrastructure collections. And you saw the UI side in Jeffrey's slides. And that is the end of the Sprint 202 review. The next review, Sprint 203, will be on January 9th. That's 3 weeks from now. So we're taking an extra week because of the holidays coming up, but it'll be at the normal time. And I'd like to thank everybody in the community, thank all our presenters today, and keep playing around. Have a good one.